I'm here at St. Stephen's Catholic Church in Portland, Oregon, and it's another rainy day. But I managed to find a place under the covered porch here, overlooking the garden. But it's a rainy day. It's not cold, just misty and wet. But that's what makes it so beautiful and green here. So thank God for that. Well, today we move on to Part 3 in Dietrich von Hildebrand's book, The Heart. Here we are. Part 3 of the book, entitled The Human Heart Transformed. So we are transformed by sanctifying grace. We begin as natural beings, and we are transformed by supernatural grace, by sanctifying grace, into a supernatural state. So chapter 1 is entitled The Heart of the True Christian. And by the way, this is the 8th day in our Novena to the Sacred Heart. All right, let's keep going. The Heart of the True Christian. We have been introduced gradually into the mystery of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and have tried to grasp both its divine quality and its mirroring of the mystery of the Incarnation. Against the true glory of the Sacred Heart, in which shine forth all treasures of knowledge and wisdom, the grave distortion of many hymns becomes obvious. Both in word and in melody, these songs not only completely miss the divine transfigured quality of the Sacred Heart, in which dwells all the fullness of divinity, but they even present the Sacred Heart in the likeness of a mediocre, sentimental human heart. This distortion has evoked an understandable opposition in many people, but an opposition which goes too far in identifying the distortion with the devotion of the Sacred Heart as such. Instead of recognizing the true nature of the Sacred Heart, as presented in its admirable litany or in the Holy Mass of the feast, one believes that the very fact of a devotion to the Sacred Heart inevitably results in these distortions. To refute this opposition, which confuses distortion with authentic devotion, we have attempted to throw into relief the divine quality of the Sacred Heart by contemplating certain passages of the Gospel. And that's what we've been doing the last 2 days. It is necessary to grasp the Sacred Heart in its true glory if the nature and depth of the devotion and its classical liturgical character are to be realized, and if we are to unmask the distortion and ungenuineness in many popular conceptions of this devotion, which find their expression in certain hymns and art forms, and even some prayers. But our attempt to understand the Sacred Heart has another and more positive importance in the correction of distortions. To increase our knowledge of the Sacred Heart, to awaken to a more intimate understanding of it, is a high value in itself. To see the Sacred Heart in its ineffable glory and to adore it is, as such, of the greatest importance. And this is also indispensable for understanding all the implications of the prayer, "Make our hearts like unto thine." If we are to understand the transformation in Christ, to which our hearts are called, our eyes must see the Sacred Heart of Jesus in its transfigured quality as the epiphany of God. The transformation of our ethos depends upon our having a true image of Christ and of his Sacred Heart. As long as we project our own mediocrity and pettiness into the Sacred Heart and nourish ourselves with this image, we remain imprisoned in that mediocrity instead of being transformed and elevated beyond ourselves. Now, sometimes one can hear or read, "Act in every situation in the same way as Christ would have acted." Okay, so that's von Hildebrand speaking. But we can think about our own day when people will say, sometimes people will say, what would Jesus do? And it's usually a little bit of a smokescreen, to sort of throw you off track of whatever it is you're talking about. Well, what would Jesus do? So sometimes one can hear or read, "Act in every situation in the same way as Christ would have acted." But this is a wrong formulation of the imitation of Christ. For the God-man, Jesus, who said, Mihi est data omnis potestas in cielo et in terra, all power in heaven and on earth is given to me, has acted and would act in many situations in a way which, for us to imitate, would be a blasphemous exaltation of ourselves, in the sense given to the word exaltation in the gospel. The imitation of Christ should rather be expressed in the words, act in a way which can stand the test in a confrontation with Christ, which is pleasing to Christ, which is in full harmony with Christ. Or, in the words, act always in the Spirit of Christ. The similitudo Dei, the likeness to God, which is man's finis primarius ultimis, man's primary ultimate end, is synonymous with the sanctificatio, the sanctification, of which St. Paul says, Haec est voluntas Dei, this is the will of God. But the similitudo Dei in no way alters our creaturehood, and in no way does away with the infinite difference between man and God. That is a very interesting and profound thought, that we would not act in every situation as in the same way as Christ would have acted, but rather we would act in a way which can stand the test in a confrontation with Christ, which is pleasing to Christ, and which is in full harmony with Christ. That was the gem from this chapter that I got. And also, I think for tomorrow what we'll do is we'll look at some of these sentimental hymns, or maybe, if I can find one. But also to look at the hymns from the Divine Office, from the feast itself, as he says, from the texts of the feast itself. So from the Mass of the feast there are no hymns, because there are no hymns in the Mass, other than, well, the Gloria is a hymn. But there are hymns in the Divine Office, and those were written specifically for the feast. So we're going to take a look at that tomorrow. But today we will continue, and this is a very short chapter. So we are here concerned with the fruits of grace in the new creature, and not with the mystery of participation in Christ, which is constituted by the fact of having received sanctifying grace. We are not concerned with the mystery expressed in the words, I am the vine, and you are the branches. But what we stated above with respect to our sanctification also applies with regard to this mystery. We are the branches, but we can never become the vine. Similarly, we must understand the meaning of the transformation of our hearts according to the Sacred Heart. It means that we attain the holy affectivity dwelling in the heart of Jesus, the true Christian ethos. But it does not refer to the unique mystery of the Sacred Heart, which is not to be severed from the Incarnation. And here we must again repeat that the heart has a function other than the will, and that God has entrusted the heart to speak an irreplaceable word, a word which sometimes differs from that to which the will is called. It would be a disastrous error to overlook this fact, and to think that the heart and will must always speak the same word. To deny that God has entrusted the heart to speak a word of its own leads to the conviction that the silencing of the heart is a religious ideal. The call of God directed to our will has to be obeyed, whatever our heart may feel, or however it may object. But this does not at all imply that our heart should conform itself to the will, in the sense that it should speak the same word as the will speaks. And here he gives a good example. In other words, we may know the right thing to do, and our heart might be breaking because we know that it's a difficult thing that God wills us to do, that we could even say is meant to break our heart. If we were to think, oh, well, my heart must be wrong, and I must be giddy with joy over this very difficult thing I have to do, well, that's not according to the truth of the matter. Here's an example. Abraham, after hearing God's command that he sacrifice his son Isaac, had to say yes with his will, but his heart had to bleed and respond with the greatest sorrow. His obedience to the commandment would not have been more perfect had his heart responded with joy. On the contrary, it would have been a monstrous attitude. According to the will of God, the sacrifice of his son called for a response of Abraham's heart, namely, that of deepest sorrow. But notwithstanding the deep reluctance of his heart, Abraham was obliged to accept this terrible cross and to confront it and to conform his will to God's commandment. Now, we could say that this is a God-willed disparity between the heart and the will. And this is the way von Hildebrand puts it. It is a God-willed disparity between the heart and the will. Now, in all cases of conflict between the two categories of motivation, termed by us the merely subjectively satisfying and value. Okay. Okay. Now it is incomparably preferable from a moral point of view if, for example, we rejoice when helping another person than if we do it only with our will, against the promptings of the heart. It is far better if our heart flows over with love for our neighbor than if we only do him good with an indifferent heart. So, we could say here that there are times when God wills a disparity between our heart and our will, and that would bring us sorrow. It would bring our heart sorrow to do the will of God. So this would be in one of those tough situations that we heard about a couple days ago, where the drunk asks for another drink, or a child who is behaving badly is pampered and encouraged to continue doing those things. Well, that's a terrible thing to do. It's hard to discipline a child. It's hard to say no to somebody, and your heart breaks to say no to somebody, but you know you must do it for the good of the other person. So that is a God-willed disparity between the heart and the will. But ideally then, for instance, when somebody is in need of our help, and let's say, we're really busy, we don't want to be bothered, but we know we should do it. Okay, so you begrudgingly do it, but your heart's not in it. Well, ideally, then your heart would be conformed to your will, and that there would not be a disparity between your heart and will in that case. Well, we'll stop there. I think that's a really good point, that a couple of good points we've gotten from this chapter. Of course, there's more to read there, and for that I'll recommend you to read the whole book. It's not a very thick book, but it's a very good one. Very thought-provoking, and I think it's been enriching for our novena here to the Sacred Heart. So we have one more chapter to go. The chapter I announced that we would do a couple days ago, chapter 2 in part 3, which is called Amare in Deo. And so, now we must go over to the church and pray our novena prayer. So you can click on a link in the description below the video to pray along with me in the church, and also to print out the novena prayers. You can also see below, there's a link to the von Hildebrand Legacy Project and some other videos that they've put out, some of them on the heart, and some other good things over there. And you might also consider making a donation to our parish on a link in the description below to help us with all the various things we need to be doing here at the parish. It's a lot of time and money and love that goes into keeping an old church in good shape and beautiful, and so we can use all the help that we can get. So we appreciate your generosity there. Well, do join me tomorrow for our 9th and last day in this novena to the Sacred Heart, and don't miss a day of prayer with us.